Well, good morning, and thank you all for joining us on this session on F&A rate proposals, departmental support. Take it away, Brian.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining me on this 20-minute presentation, quick presentation on the F&A rate proposal, focusing mainly on the departmental support portion of the process. So I wanted to take a brief second here to introduce a poll question, and looks like it's popped up already. And if you could take a few seconds to answer the question, that will kind of help me understand who's in the audience.
Okay, thank you all so much. I am going to share the results with y'all now.
So just a few, about 12% have was involved in the process last time. That is good in the sense of I'm glad that there's some people that are interested in understanding how the department helps out with the F&A study. So why don't we just go ahead and get started, and I will. So today's presentation, the objective mainly is to do a quick overview of the F&A rate proposal development process, kind of define the elements of what's within the F&A rate, and talk about what we consider to be direct versus indirect costs. The presentation will, towards the end, will highlight the components of the proposal, and then the elements that we require assistance from not only academic departments, but the other departments on campus that assist with the proposal, as well as a timeline when we'll start knocking on your doors related to the survey. So the four main objectives or the areas of focus are giving you a 20,000-foot look at the F&A rate proposal and the elements of it, a brief highlight of the research activity in fiscal year 22, and briefly talked about the F&A rate agreement. Jump more in depth about the space survey and what we'll ask you for down the road, and then a timeline of when we'll ask for that information. So just a quick overview. So facilities administrative costs, as you can read on your own here, there are costs that are incurred for common or joint objectives, and it makes it very hard to identify those costs to specifically to either a sponsored project, instructional activity, or the sponsor research activity, that type of thing. So we have a methodology to be able to get those types of costs reimbursed to the university. And so what are really the elements of the F&A rate, or the facilities administrative rate? That rate represents a single number that that provides a reimbursement to the university for the use of our infrastructure, buildings, and equipment. We can recover interest on buildings, the operations and maintenance, utilities, housekeeping, all that related to the maintenance of the buildings, administrative related costs, not only central related activities such as finance and payroll, and mainly finance and payroll, your own departmental administrative costs related to supporting research, obviously the sponsored projects administration part of it, Office of Sponsored Programs, the Office of Clinical Trials, and IRB, and so on and so forth. And then there's a reimbursement element for the library. So the F portion of the F&A, or the facilities components, are noted here: the depreciation for buildings and equipment, interest on any debt related to buildings, operations and maintenance, and library. The building depreciation, interest, and O&M are allocated out to basically instruction or research and other activities for the functional use of total building space. Whereas equipment depreciation, those costs are allocated ultimately to research using the functional use of a particular room that piece of equipment is located in. And then the library does not use space at all. It is kind of an oddball calculation using FTEs or full-time equivalents, and then the salaries and wages across campus. The administrative components, as we kind of highlighted before, are general administration for the university, departmental administration within the academic departments, sponsored project administration, and then student admin services. General administration and DA are allocated out using what we call total direct costs. The SPA amount is allocated to research using modified total direct cost or MTDC, and then student services is directly allocated out to the instructional portion of what we call final cost objectives. The administrative component on the F&A part of it is capped at 26 points, 26% of the modified total direct cost, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we go along here. So what we end up doing is the F&A costs are pooled into those major categories listed. The F portion of the F&A is the black. The A portion for administrative is the A font. Those dollars are allocated to what we call final cost objectives, which are basically instruction, research, and other activities. And those are allocated out to those final cost objectives to get you to the current rate that we have at the moment of 55.5%. The facilities portion of that rate is 29.5 points of the 55-point rate. Administrative portion is capped at 26. And just as an example for you, in 2019, when we did the last proposal, we actually calculate for the administration part of it, 29.2 points. So we basically leave 3.2 points on the table that we can never be reimbursed for, even though we expend those costs related to supporting the research activities here at the university. Results from FY22 as a quick highlight are, we had about F&A recovery of around 225 million. As was mentioned yesterday by Dr. Gordon Larson, she mentioned that the awards at the university were around 1.2 billion, and we had expenditures of around $1 billion. As I noted before, our current F&A rate is for organized research is 55.5. We do have two other rates, on-campus rates of other sponsored activities at 36, and then a rarely used one of instruction of 50. So the F&A agreement that we have now was signed for fiscal year 21 and goes through the end of fiscal year 24. So to determine our next base year for the next proposal, it's always the fiscal year before the last fiscal year of the rate agreement, which happens to be fiscal year 23. And that's why we're talking now about the F&A study, preparing for initial activities, preparing for FY23, and then once the fiscal year ends, jumping in full force and preparing the proposal. So the department assistants that we look for from the university. So to prepare the study, we obtain financial, space, utility usage data across campus. As noted here, a lot of our data actually comes via the finance and budget group, the published financial statements, expenditure detail out of PeopleSoft, Connect Carolina. We go to the Treasury Department to provide us the bond interest information from bonds issued by the university. The depreciation numbers for both building and equipment are provided. And then of course we use payroll data in the F&A study as well. Facilities provides a good portion of items that we need for the study, including the space database, which we'll talk about more as we go along, out of the SPOTS database. Those are you familiar with SPOTS. And then these facilities provides us with utility usage by building for all the different utilities, electricity, steam, those types of water, those types of utilities, and then the usage by building on campus for the O&M portion of it. And then for the space part of it, once we get the spot space data, we go out to the departments and do what we call a space survey to the academic departments. An overview of the space survey is basically that we don't really do a survey for every academic department on campus. We only look at the research intensive departments, and we determine what those are using salaries charged to organize research. And so as an example, departments like biology and chemistry and your School of Medicine basic science departments are heavily funded with research, and and when it comes to the survey, we end up looking at those departments every time we do the F&A study. When we do the survey, we are only looking at research type intensive rooms. We'll detail that in the next slide. The survey statistics that we come up with will help us allocate the following costs, as we kind of noted in the presentation, or excuse me, in the slides previous. For the facilities portion, it's the operations and maintenance, the depreciation, building and equipment, and then of course interest. As I noted before, the administrative costs are capped at 26 points, but the facilities costs, there is not a cap on those. So it is very, very critical for us to maximize to the best of our ability the F portion of the F&A rate that are allocated to those research, to the research function, because they are uncapped. So the rooms that we survey, we don't do every room in the, we only survey laboratory space and support rooms. We do research lab offices. Those are mainly what we would call it dry labs. Some theoretical science happens in those rooms where they probably don't have that particular PI doesn't have a lab per se, where most of their work is done in office space. So we'll designate some of the offices as research offices. We will also survey greenhouse space here on campus as well, which is mainly biology. The next slide we'll talk about the two-step process that we do during the space survey with the academic department. So the first step in the space survey is to go to the academic departments that we select to survey and ask them to verify and identify all of their space. We will provide you a list of out of spots, and then we'll ask you to verify the physical room data that you occupied during FY23. That would be, building a room number, make sure the room types are identified correctly, not so much verifying square footage, but basically identifying and making sure that we have all of your space. And that it would include not only the laboratory space, offices, administrative offices, any space that belongs to that particular department. During that time, we'll also ask you to identify any relevant information that would be useful for us in the study. That would include identifying any occupants that aren't paid by the university, unpaid occupants, or visiting faculty members. Important or portion element of it would be identifying the research service center space, and if there was any space that you owned but was vacant during all of the fiscal year, and then any open comments or any other information you'd like to provide. So when we do the survey, we will ask you for those rooms that we survey, basically the labs and any support rooms, to identify who those rooms are assigned to when it comes to a faculty member or a faculty member or PI. And then once we have that information, and we have a space survey tool that most likely we will use the one that we used last time that Huron provided. And once we have that PI information, we'll have other information within the tool that will identify not only PI, but it will identify their sponsored funding and the occupants that were paid off that sponsored funding that most likely were working in that room. And then we would have you go in and verify that all that information makes sense, that those projects were being performed in those labs, and that the occupants that we've identified will be part of that particular room. And then the last step that we would ask you to do is to functionalize the space, meaning how was it used? Was it used, the percentage of the room used for research purposes, instructional purposes, et cetera, clinical. So the timeline, we really won't get started when it comes to the space survey till after the end of the fiscal year. We will, and during the summer, probably during this time period and into very early fall, performing training to train the departments on how to use the survey tool, ask you for that PI to room information, and then open up the tool for the departments, for the survey departments to use. We'll have a deadline of towards the end of fall of 2023, and then we in OSP will jump in and look at the data, come back to you, ask questions, have follow-up meetings where necessary. So the biggest thing that you can do for us and to help yourselves during the fiscal year is to make sure that your SPOTS database information is kept up to date. Making sure that all your space is assigned in SPOTS, that the room types are appropriate, that identifying occupants, especially PIs in particular rooms, will make the process a whole lot easier when we come back around a year from now. Also, performing an equipment inventory when central finance comes around and asks you to prepare that information. The biggest part of that for us is making sure that the location, the building and room number of that equipment is assigned to the appropriate room. As I mentioned before, we allocate depreciation on the equipment based on the functional use of the room that it's assigned to. So that's basically it for this presentation. If you have any questions, you can contact me or J.R. Pike. He's the manager of cost analysis and effort reporting. One of his main roles is working on preparing the F&A study as well as the effort reporting portion. So to that point, I will open it up to questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Brian. That was a great presentation. And we do have a few questions.
Excellent.
So the first question is, will remote work affect the new F&A rate?
At this point, no. There will be impacts for departments that maybe have gone full remote and they maybe have potentially have downsized their space. The ones that are working hybrid, that are working at home and then still have office space, probably not so much of an impact. I personally don't think, and my colleagues in other universities, at least at this point, don't think that there's going to be a huge impact when it comes to the lab space. And the reason is, for obvious reasons, they would need that lab space to be able to perform the research. So they would need to come on campus, collaborate with their lab managers and the people that are working on the grants and all that. So at this point, there hasn't been a major impact, at least in that area. We haven't really, as an example, our office still has all our office space, even though we're mainly working remote. If some of that changes over the next year, we'll have to adjust those types of items. But that's a very, very good question.
Thank you, Brian. So the next one is, what if a PI's work is now completely remote and has given up all physical allotted space?
Well, that would be a problem in the sense that if they are working fully remote, they don't have any assigned space, then there's nothing for us to capture office space wise or whatever if they're not even assigned an office space. So that, I mean, that's a good point, but that's going to be a problem not for us, but not only for us, but for all other universities as well. So yeah, the major problem that we're going to have next study is identifying that type of space, and if that space is actually used by a faculty member that is working 100% remote, hopefully any space that has been relinquished hopefully has been picked up and will be used for research for other purposes with other individuals. Again, another really good question.
So the next question is there a SPOTS template available?
A SPOTS template available. I'm not aware of one, but let me follow up on that and talk to facilities and see if there's a template that's out there, and we can add that to the questions that we will post with the presentation. That's a really good question. I could see where a template would be very helpful.
Thank you, Brian. So the next one is, how does office space occupied by clinical research staff get assessed? Clinical research staff could be mixed use, grant and industry sponsored funding.
So offices there's a set methodology that we have to use when related to offices. And it looks at the salaries and wages of the assigned department and allocates all offices, or excuse me, functionalizes all offices based on the square footage of that particular department. So we don't functionalize the space of office for each individual. We are required to functionalize office space based on the functional activities of the department. So if the particular department was 65% research, 30% instruction, and 5% administrative, then all offices will be assigned that functional assignment. If it's clinical, then it would be, obviously be assigned to clinical as well as research.
Excellent. Thank you, Brian. So there's another question.
Great questions.
I know, this is a great group. We'll take it. So the next question is, will there be some kind of discussion about F&A split inputted to Ramses? How do we ensure the split is done accurately?
Unfortunately, I cannot answer that question. That's a question. When it comes to the F&A calculation, me and my group calculate the rate the recoveries of the FNA are outside any of my involvement, are more related to agreements the different schools have with the university, with the provost office. So the split of FNA and even the split of FNA which I know is done within Ramsey's, is unfortunately, that's an area I don't know very much about.
So we have another question, which is, if you are a center or service center within a department, how is the split of FNA determined?
Kind of falls into the same question as the previous one, how the FNA is divvied up between the university and provided back to the various centers. Yeah, I can answer to you how we would handle that space in the FNA study, but I don't think that's what the question is. I think the question is more of when the dollars are recovered, how they're split to the centers. And that, unfortunately, I am not privy to.
And Brian, I think that is the end of all our questions.
Okay. I appreciate everybody attending, and I hope this helped, and we'll identify when we come knocking on the door a year from now, that you'll have an idea of what we'll be doing over the next about 6 months or so after the fiscal year completes. So I appreciate everybody attending. Quick thanks to the OSP folks who are behind the scenes for the symposium. Amanda, Catherine, Sam, and Casey, I appreciate all their help. It's made my job a whole lot easier when it comes to actually doing these presentations. So I'd like to thank them as well.
Oh, thank you so much, Brian. We really appreciate it. And you make it easy working with you. Thank you all our attendees, and we look forward to seeing you at the next session.